We want to have a more pro-family policy. Now
there was
you
just
asked
a vote
about,
on this, you know that.
Well,
and you weren't there.
But Margaret,
it was a messaging bill, I'll give you that.
It was a show vote.
I'm with you on that.
And if I had been there, it would have failed.
So
and
tell me specifically what you want to do to expand the child care tax credit, because it's like $2,000.
We know America's dear JD Vance is full of lies. He's a fantastic speaker, we'll give him that. In fact, he's so good at it that it's all he can do. So it's pretty heartbreaking when an intellectually superior and well-informed opponent, like Margaret Brennan here, doesn't take this into consideration and decides to destroy him. These political moments, like Vance's pre-election appearance, feel less like interviews and more like crime scenes. Only the victim is logic, and the weapon? A smug, over-rehearsed JD Vance who has no idea what he's talking about. Luckily for America, though, the investigator who's laying out all the evidence before torching him with a smile is face the nation's Margaret Brennan.
You supported the Supreme Court ruling recently on mifepristone, the so-called abortion pill.
JD Vance's first interview as vice president in the Trump 2.0 administration was also, safe to say, a mess. It was almost comical to see Brennan try to keep the incredulity off her face as Vance articulately derailed into what were at best half-truths and, at worst, downright lies. Like, how often can an interviewer fact-check a guest without turning the interview into an actual debate? Well-spoken lies don't graduate to truths, but that's a fact that JD Vance seems to have made his mission to somehow change. How is he going to accomplish that? We don't know, but MAGA supporters certainly seem fanatic about it. But then again, what aren't they fanatic about? Anyway, let's talk about how Margaret Brennan obliterated JD Vance's half-baked, poorly microwaved ideas right on national television.
So still count on the federal government, but watch that space. Let me ask you about another area that you campaigned on quite a lot, and there was a flurry of activity on, and that has to do with immigration.
Sure.
The U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops this week condemned some of the executive orders signed by President Trump, specifically those allowing immigration and customs enforcement to enter churches and to enter schools.
The moment JD Vance appeared on Face the Nation, you could practically see the self-importance oozing through the screen. There he was, sitting upright like a kid who cheated on his homework, but still expects a gold star, ready to drop some lines he clearly practiced in the Senate bathroom mirror. But Margaret Brennan? She wasn't having it. She came with facts, receipts, a Rolodex of JD's greatest hits. If by hits we mean wildly hypocritical policy positions and tweets that read like they were written on NyQuil. One of the most glorious moments came when Brennan pressed him about his flip-flopping on immigration policies.
Do you personally support the idea of conducting a raid or enforcement action in a church service, at a school?
Well, let me address this. Of course, if you have a person who is convicted of a violent crime, whether they're an illegal immigrant or a non-illegal immigrant, you have to go and get that person to protect the public safety.
Remember, JD Vance was all about vetting immigrants so that the government could be sure they would be law-abiding citizens. But after the Oklahoma incident, he seems to have decided to miraculously walk away from that statement. Now, it looked like even vetting wasn't good enough for Trump 2.0, something that Brennan wasn't going to let slide. So Brennan asked, as calmly as someone asking if you want cream in your coffee, why Vance suddenly changed his mind and started pretending to be as devout a Catholic as one can be, which is ironic, considering his sheer presence was enough to take Pope Francis out of the census. JD Vance, in true JD Vance fashion, panicked. He tried throwing around buzzwords like for public safety and violent crimes, but it was too late. Brennan was already dissecting him with the kind of poise you'd expect from a surgeon, if the patient were a bad argument wearing a suit. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Because if we have to sit through another JD Vance interview without losing brain cells, we're gonna need moral support.
Well, it sounded to a lot of these allies of the United States like they were being described as adversaries or autocrats.
Margaret Brennan has always been quick to catch on whenever JD Vance starts going off the rails. And this was especially glaring during the recent Munich Security Conference, where JD delivered his unbelievably tone-deaf new sheriff in town speech. Now, the context of this event was grave and serious. European countries coming together to support Ukraine since the relentless war began. JD Vance, representing one of the biggest superpowers in the world, though, didn't seem to get the memo, which is pretty on brand for Mr. Hillbilly if you ask any media-literate American. Margaret Brennan was right on the money when she mentioned that it seemed like JD Vance was trying to write off strong U.S. allies as adversaries and autocrats. Something to note here is the way the smile fell off her face at that moment. After all, any genuine journalist would see just how ridiculous the situation was getting.
Went out of his way to meet with the head of the AfD. That's a political party that's under investigation in Germany because it's so far right and for potentially conducting extremism.
In this session, she also, in obvious disbelief, walks viewers through JD Vance's ridiculous far-right stance. If you take a moment to step back and let the situation sink in, you might even plunge into a panicky haze. Hats off to Margaret Brennan for continuously providing her services to the shell-shocked American public by translating Vance's cartoonish, evil vocabulary into more human words. Yes, like calling terrorism out for what it is. We'll even go as far as to say that Margaret Brennan is the hero of the hour. Maybe not a hero in the traditional sense, but in a media landscape full of softball questions and senators getting away with murder-by-word salad, Margaret Brennan showing up with basic facts and a functioning BS meter deserves its holiday.
In 2016, you called your running mate Donald Trump unfit for the nation's highest office, and you said he could be America's Hitler.
There's a definite trend with JD Vance, just either outright lying or skipping past uncomfortable questions. Margaret Brennan clearly points out the inconsistency in JD Vance's rhetoric, and despite her straightforward question, he does not even come into the neighborhood of addressing the question in his long-winded explanation.
Of a long list of questions that he simply didn't answer. He said words, but didn't answer.
Now, this was something that MSNBC picked up on too, just proving that all the MAGA criticism of Margaret Brennan is unfounded. Lawrence O'Donnell pointed out that JD Vance said words, but he didn't answer. The funniest, most hysterical thing is that this pattern is as plain as day. Anyone with even a shred of media literacy can tell that not only does Vance not answer questions, he also joyfully goes off track, over to something so unrelated that even the hosts are at a loss about. Like, where do they even start fact-checking? Kudos to them for trying, though, because anyone else would have given up. Never to join the JD Vance-plagued society again.
2 weeks ago, you were on Fox News and you said, if you protested peacefully on January 6th and had Merrick Garland's Department of Justice treat you like a gang member, you should be pardoned. If you committed violence on that day, obviously you shouldn't be pardoned. Did you counsel the president against these blanket pardons for 1,500 people?
If exasperation had a face, it would be Margaret Brennan in this disastrous interview that has every Trump Musk zealot in a frenzy. No, really, at this point, it's become impressive just how self-assuredly Vance takes one sentence and then runs away with it, so far away from the point that any answer becomes meaningless. It's almost an art.
Margaret, I noticed that you cut off the thing that I said immediately after that. The full quote is that, of course, there are gray areas. And here's the nature of the gray area. Merrick Garland's Department of Justice denied constitutional protections in the prosecution.
Even here, as Brennan patiently spells out the exact question for the dear American vice president, he fixates on an irrelevant aspect and makes it the hill he'll die on. You know, it'll suffice to say that JD Vance is the terms and conditions asterisk personified. He himself comes with a scroll of fine text that the brain cell deficient voters naturally couldn't decipher. What's even the point of making a politically grounded statement if you're going to stay in gray areas? It doesn't make sense. But Margaret Brennan, bound to journalistic integrity, is forced to sit through another mind-numbing, wordy explanation of how the Trump administration is totally justified in their actions regarding the J6 pardon.
How do you plan to implement that policy?
Well, it's called the child tax credit, and we should expand the child tax credit. If you think about what the child tax
So you
credit
and the Biden
does,
administration agree on the child care tax credit?
well, we think it should be bigger. I think President Trump and I believe in an expanded child tax credit.
It looks like the path to making America great again is a circle, because that's all that Trump 2.0's vice president seems to go in. Circles. The exhaustion on Brennan's face would be hilarious if it weren't because of the very bitter reality that America is, in a pinch. If we go the understatement route, that is. JD's stance on the child tax credit policy keeps quaking, just like his views on literally any other subject. He can't decide what he wants for the country, and it looks like Margaret Brennan might know, but is too baffled to admit it. She can't help but let a smile crack when Vance walks into it himself. That he and Trump had every intention of stealing the spotlight and credit for this policy, originally implemented by the Biden administration. Don't worry, there's still a takeaway from the agony of Brennan enduring Vance's rambling. Unfortunately, though, it's this. JD Vance is the kind of guy who acts like he read the Constitution once and now thinks he's Alexander Hamilton with a podcast. But when faced with someone who knows what they're talking about, he crumbles faster than his old tweets about Trump. If you enjoyed watching JD Vance get called out by Margaret Brennan, you'll love to see our video of him getting absolutely obliterated by Jon Stewart.